There are moments in geopolitics that are quiet. No declarations of war, no gunfire. But a single misstep is enough to knock the world order off its axis. When a superpower begins treating sovereignty as a bargaining chip, the question is no longer who's right or wrong. It's who dares to stand up and hold the line. Today, Greenland is more than just an icy island. It is a litmus test for the rule of law, for alliances, and for leadership in a world coming apart at the seams. In this analysis, we'll take a hard look at what's unfolding behind the tough rhetoric and why Canada is stepping into a role it has long avoided. If you're interested in deep, unvarnished geopolitical analysis, subscribe to the channel and follow the real forces reshaping the world right now. The world rarely collapses with a loud bang. It often fractures in silence, through offhand remarks, through repeated tests of reaction, until no one is alert enough to notice when the boundaries have quietly vanished. The current phase of the global order carries exactly that feeling. Not an explosion of crisis, but a slow erosion of principles once thought untouchable. The statements about Greenland first emerged as a shock, then quickly got swept into the news cycle where everything has a short shelf life. But the issue isn't whether they were shocking. The issue is that they were repeated, linked to tariffs, to economic pressure, and wrapped in the same logic as the threat of force. When those elements converge, they're no longer just words. They become signals. And in international politics, signals matter far more than stated intentions. What's most concerning isn't that a superpower said something unprecedented. It's how the rest of the world responded. Most Western capitals fell back on familiar caution. They dodged direct questions, scaled back public commitments, and hoped time would dull the tension. It's the reflex of an order used to living in a buffer zone, where conflicts are managed through joint statements with language vague enough that no one has to take clear responsibility. But that buffer no longer exists. When pressure becomes a legitimate policy tool, silence is no longer neutral. It becomes a form of passive complicity. History shows that the most dangerous moments don't come when superpowers clash openly, but when no one is willing to say, "This is unacceptable." It is in that vacuum that Canada begins to move. Not through fiery speeches or shows of force. The shift is quieter, more structural. Mark Carney, with a background shaped by seeing the world through the lens of systemic risk, doesn't approach this as a conventional political dispute. He sees an escalating sequence forming, where every retreat by others invites the next step in pressure. In a very short time, Canada's trips, meetings, and strategic adjustments have started to form a clearer picture. This isn't a bid for leadership, but a response to a cold reality. If no one upholds the order, it will be rewritten by the logic of the strongest. Putting the deployment of forces on the table isn't symbolic. It's an acknowledgement that the era of relying on words alone is over. And when the story reaches that point, all eyes inevitably turn to Greenland. No longer a distant name on the map, it has become the place where every fracture in the new order converges. A land once considered peripheral now stands as the first true test of whether the world will move forward by the rule of law or slide fully into an era where strategic position determines destiny. For much of the 20th century, Greenland existed on the outer edges of strategic awareness. It appeared on maps as a massive block of ice, sparsely populated, rarely mentioned, and seemingly detached from the flows of power. But geopolitics doesn't care whether a place gets attention. It only cares about location, control, and the value a territory holds when the order around it begins to shift. Greenland sits at a point where continents meet. From here, North America looks toward Europe. And from here, the entire Arctic unfolds as a strategic space that is waking up. As the ice melts, sea routes long sealed off for centuries begin to emerge, shortening the distance between major economic hubs and altering the logic of global trade. But shipping is only the surface. Beneath the ice and beyond the horizon, Greenland plays a far deeper role in the structure of security. In the Western defense architecture, Greenland is an irreplaceable link. Early warning systems, airspace control, and the ability to track strategic movements across continents are all anchored to this location. It is not NATO's periphery. It is a silent but vital linchpin. That's why Greenland becomes most critical not when the world is stable, but when the order starts to shake. The shift lies in the fact that what was once common ground is now being put up for negotiation. When statements about Greenland become tied to tariffs, to economic pressure, and to veiled hints of escalation, the nature of the issue shifts from diplomacy to power. This is no longer a story about a faraway territory. It's a question of whether the principle of sovereignty can still stand firm against the logic of coercion. If a keystone like Greenland can be placed under pressure, then the entire system of collective defense is forced to ask itself, where exactly is the red line? And more dangerously, that question doesn't just echo in NATO conference rooms. It's being closely studied in capitals outside the alliance. In geopolitics, precedents are never idle. They're always waiting to be copied. That's why Greenland has become a test, not a test of pure military strength, but a test of will and of a rules-based order's ability to defend itself. If the response to pressure stops at vague declarations, then the message will be clear. Principles once considered inviolable can now be bent if enough force is applied. For Canada, this is no abstract debate. Greenland lies to the north, within the same strategic space that Ottawa understands better than most. An unstable Arctic won't stay on the map. It will spill over into trade, security, and directly impact Canada's vital interests. Sitting on the sidelines is no longer a safe option. But Canada's response does not carry the heat of impulse or emotion. There are no loud statements, no hasty displays of resolve. Instead, there is a cold, calculated approach, one that resembles systems governance more than ceremonial diplomacy. The issue is viewed as a systemic risk. If left unaddressed, it will accumulate, spread, and eventually spiral beyond control. It is here that Mark Carney's role becomes clear. He doesn't approach Greenland as a political symbol, but as a dangerous variable in a system tilting out of balance. From that perspective, Canada's next steps are not meant to provoke confrontation, but to reestablish limits. And to understand why these decisions are being made with such precision, you need to look at the person behind them. A leader not accustomed to speaking in abstract values, but to measuring risk before it becomes a crisis. Mark Carney entered politics without the usual baggage of a career politician. No long history of campaigning, no catchy slogans, no symbolic rhetoric. What he brought instead was the mindset of someone who had spent his entire career staring at cold numbers, complex models, and worst-case scenarios that most people would rather ignore. In that world, crises rarely arrive as sudden shocks. They build from overlooked risks, early signals dismissed, until the system passes the point of no return. That foundation is what makes Carney respond differently to what's happening now. While many Western leaders still see tough talk as part of political theater, Carney sees a pattern of escalation taking shape. For him, the issue isn't in the specific words, it's in the trajectory. Once economic pressure, territorial threats, and strategic ambiguity start operating under a shared logic, the security system gets pushed out of its stable zone. In the language of risk management, escalation isn't abstract. It's a red alert. It signals that self-correcting mechanisms are breaking down, and without early intervention, the cost of resolving the crisis will multiply exponentially. That's why Carney avoids loud condemnations or rhetorical standoffs. He focuses on structural adjustments, because only structure provides resilience when a crisis hits. Canada's trade and investment decisions during this period reflect that mindset clearly. Expanding economic space, reducing dependence on a single partner, and building financial shock absorbers aren't emotional pivots. They're deliberate preparations for the worst-case scenario. Carney understands that in an asymmetric confrontation, the side that gets economically strangled first will lose its political freedom of choice. What sets Carney apart from many other leaders is that he doesn't believe in hope as a strategy. Hope that the other side will dial things down. Hope that tensions will fade on their own. In the financial world, hope isn't a governance tool, and Carney brings that same principle into foreign policy. He acts on the assumption that risk will materialize, not disappear. From that perspective, Greenland is no longer some distant diplomatic story. It's a dangerous pressure point in the entire system. If ambiguity is allowed to persist, the cost won't just be measured in icy territory. It will be paid in the loss of trust in the alliance's ability to defend itself. And once that trust crumbles, every mechanism of deterrence becomes significantly weaker. Because he has prepared economically, politically, and through alliances, Carney now has the space to consider firmer moves without panic. There's no rush. No impulsive response to satisfy public opinion. Instead, there's a chain of decisions laid out by the logic of risk mitigation. Reinforce the home front, send clear signals, and act only when the necessary conditions are in place. By that point, considering a troop deployment is no longer controversial in principle. It's simply the next step in a process that's been carefully thought through. In risk governance, there are moments when inaction becomes the most dangerous choice. When the signals are clear enough, when precedent begins to set in, silence will be interpreted as consent. And it's exactly at that threshold where the story exits the meeting rooms and enters the military domain. Not through dramatic declarations, but through the quiet movement of actual forces. Because in the world of power, the strongest message is rarely delivered through a microphone. It's in what has already been put in motion before a single word is spoken. In military affairs, the most important signals are rarely spoken aloud. They come earlier, in quiet adjustments to plans, in closed-door meetings, and ultimately in the specific movement of people and hardware. Canada's consideration of deploying a small force to Greenland fits squarely within that logic. It's not a show of bravado, nor a direct challenge. It's a way to erase ambiguity before ambiguity can be exploited. Exercises and deployments within NATO were designed precisely for moments like this, when tensions haven't yet exploded into crisis, but are already sharp enough to cast doubt on previously safe assumptions. In such a context, military presence carries a significance far beyond the actual size of deployed force. A small group of soldiers doesn't shift the balance of power, but it changes how each side reads the situation. By moving troops closer to the Arctic, Canada sends a message with three layers. First, to its allies. Collective commitments don't just exist on paper. They are being prepared for real-world execution. In an alliance where trust is the foundation, seeing a member take proactive steps to share the burden is deeply reassuring. It's a reminder that NATO is not just a political forum, it is still a functioning security structure. The second message is directed outward. To any potential adversary watching the developments in Greenland closely, this presence is a signal that contingencies have been anticipated. In geopolitics, the greatest danger to deterrence isn't weak strength, it's hesitation. When action arrives early, it narrows the window for risky calculations built on the assumption that the alliance won't respond. And the third message, though unspoken, is aimed directly at Washington. It sets a soft but clear boundary. Pressure will no longer be met with total silence. Canada is not seeking confrontation, but it will not allow precedents to form without a response. In the logic of power, boundaries exist only if someone is willing to stand on them. What's notable is Canada's domestic reaction. Instead of the deep divisions often seen around sensitive foreign policy issues, a relatively quick consensus has emerged. From the government to the opposition, the position on NATO and alliance obligations has remained consistent. That unity doesn't stem from military zeal, but from a recognition that the cost of inaction could far exceed the risk of a calculated step forward. In this light, the troop deployment isn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. It's the visible tip of a longer preparation process, one in which economic, diplomatic, and military elements have been aligned to create a firmer stance. When the military move happens, it doesn't shock the domestic audience, because it fits into a logic that's been coherently laid out from the start. But no move in Greenland stays local. Every shift in the Arctic echoes far beyond the frozen horizon. In other capitals, governments are watching closely to see how NATO responds to internal pressure. Because if that resolve falters, if deterrence becomes diluted, the consequences won't end in the north. It's at this point that the story outgrows Canada and Greenland. It touches on bigger questions about NATO's strength in an increasingly fragmented world, about how Russia and other adversaries will interpret every sign of hesitation or solidarity. When one link in the chain is tested, the entire structure trembles. And that chain reaction is what makes every decision in Greenland carry far more weight than any number of troops might suggest. Greenland has never just been a story about a frozen landmass. In geopolitics, no action exists in a vacuum, and no signal is interpreted by only one audience. Every movement in the Arctic is part of a much larger picture, one in which great powers and rivals are constantly testing the true resilience of NATO in an era of prolonged instability. From Moscow, what's unfolding in Greenland isn't viewed with emotion, but with the cold logic of deterrence. Russia doesn't need NATO to collapse entirely to gain advantage. What it looks for are cracks, signs that the alliance can hesitate, fracture, or freeze when confronted with sensitive scenarios. In that strategic mindset, NATO's response to internal pressure is just as, if not more, valuable than its reaction to external threats. A strong alliance isn't measured by how many statements it makes, but by its ability to act in unity when boundaries are tested. If NATO cannot clearly demonstrate that the sovereignty of a member state or a territory to collective security is non-negotiable, then the entire concept of deterrence begins to erode. And that erosion doesn't make noise. It happens quietly, through the acceptance of small precedents. This connects directly to the war in Ukraine. Deterrence doesn't operate in isolated theaters. It's a chain of interconnected perceptions. NATO's response in the Arctic influences how Russia gauges the alliance's resolve in Eastern Europe and vice versa. If one link shows hesitation, others will be tested more aggressively. That's the chain reaction logic every strategic planner understands well. In this context, Canada's move carries meaning far beyond its actual military scale. It doesn't shift the balance of forces, but it alters the calculus. It signals that the alliance still has the ability to recalibrate and respond before being forced into a reactive posture. To Moscow, this message isn't provocative. It's a warning. Assumptions about NATO paralysis may be wrong, but the ripple effect doesn't just travel eastward. It also circles back inside the alliance. Medium and smaller member states are watching closely. They're asking whether security commitments will truly be upheld when pressure comes from the least predictable directions. In a world where major powers act with growing unpredictability, allied trust is no longer a given. It must be reinforced through concrete action. That's why Greenland has become a focal point of layered strategic anxiety, not because it's likely to become a battlefield, but because it's where core principles are tested in a phase just before open conflict. And in moments like that, clarity is worth more than evasion. Once military signals have been sent and lines quietly drawn, the game doesn't stop on the ground. It shifts into a more intricate arena, where worldviews on order, coercion, and power collide head-on. Not in barracks or command centers, but in closed-door meetings among leaders, financiers, and those who shape the global narrative. And it is precisely there, in Davos, that two visions of power, coercion, and international rules will stand side by side in the same room, revealing more starkly than ever the fractures that are shaping the future of the world. This year's Davos doesn't carry the usual air of optimistic promises or dazzling visions of the future. It's heavier, quieter, more candid. In the snow-covered corridors and soundproof meeting rooms, the question is no longer, where is the world heading? But rather, what minimum principles can still hold to keep it from descending into chaos? In that space, power isn't expressed through applause, but through hushed exchanges, where every word carries long-term consequences. Mark Carney arrived in Davos with his characteristic composure, a man not drawn to the spotlight. He didn't need dramatic speeches. His presence alone carried weight. Carney spoke about risk, about the fragility of global supply chains, and about the cost of treating coercion as a normal policy tool. His language wasn't moralistic, it was cautionary. He didn't call for confrontation, but underscored that a system only survives when its participants believe the rules will be upheld. In that same space, Donald Trump was also present, offering a starkly different worldview. Here, pressure isn't the problem, it's the solution. Tariffs, threats, and unpredictability are viewed as legitimate levers to force concessions. These two approaches differ not just in method, but in philosophy. One believes stability arises from rules and cooperation. The other sees order as something imposed through strength and the ability to inflict pain. What makes Davos remarkable isn't that both visions coexist. It's that they no longer bother to hide their conflict. In closed-door meetings, the divide is more openly acknowledged than ever. European leaders worry about a world where every commitment can be walked back. Middle powers seek to safeguard their strategic space amid rising waves of coercion. And investors, long accustomed to rule-based stability, are starting to question the very foundations they've relied on for decades. At this moment, Davos resembles a hall of mirrors, reflecting the fractures in global leadership. No joint declaration is strong enough to mask the reality. The world is entering a phase where consensus can no longer be assumed. Every country must now answer for itself. Which side of the emerging order are they on? For Carney, Davos isn't a place to convince opponents to change overnight. It's a place to connect with those who still believe coercion cannot be the foundation of lasting stability. In a world where major powers are increasingly willing to break rules for short-term gain, maintaining a network of like-minded middle powers has become a strategy for survival. As the meetings wrap and snow continues to fall outside, no one leaves Davos under the illusion that tensions have been resolved. But one thing is clearer than before. The clash between two worldviews is no longer a distant threat. It is unfolding now, in the same rooms, in the same moment, and it will continue to shape how the world responds to the next crisis. Greenland, after all, is not the end of this story. It is merely the first sign that the world has crossed into dangerous territory, where rules once seen as foundational must now prove their worth under harsher conditions than ever before. When a remote, sparsely populated frozen land becomes the center of power calculations, it says far more about the state of global order than it does about Greenland itself. What's most notable isn't the scale of the tension, but how the actors respond. The world has grown used to major powers setting the rules, but this moment reveals something different. When traditional centers of power become unpredictable, a vacuum appears. And in that vacuum, middle powers must choose, either stand by and watch or step in to slow the system's slide. Canada has chosen not to stand by. Mark Carney hasn't stepped forward as a leader chasing a historic role or symbolic moments. He acts like a risk manager inside a system drifting out of balance. Rather than reacting emotionally or chasing short-term headlines, he builds structure. Diversifying trade, strengthening alliances, preparing militarily, and only acting when every piece is in place. This isn't chest-thumping toughness, it's quiet resolve. The message Canada is sending isn't a challenge to anyone. It's a reminder of something fundamental. Rules only exist if someone is willing to defend them, even when there's no immediate benefit. In a world where coercion is becoming normalized, that choice is a long-term strategic stance, more meaningful than any bold declaration. Greenland then becomes a microcosm of what might unfold elsewhere. Today it's the Arctic, tomorrow it might be a shipping lane, a supply chain, or another strategic buffer zone. The question is no longer whether crises will spread, it's whether the world is ready to face them with structure and principle, or continue letting each small precedent chip away at our shared foundation. In that picture, the role of middle powers becomes more critical than ever. They can't impose a new order, but they can prevent the old one from collapsing entirely if they act deliberately and in coordination. Canada, at this moment, is testing that role. Not to become a new center of power, but to help keep the world from sliding into a state where brute force is the only language left. The story of Greenland reminds us that global stability isn't a natural state. It's the result of difficult choices, often made quietly by those who understand that the cost of inaction can be far greater than the risk of a responsible step forward. And it is in those choices that the future of the international order is being rewritten, line by line. If you see it differently, if you imagine scenarios where this story could take another turn, leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to keep following deep, candid, and unfiltered analysis of the power shifts shaping our world today, don't forget to subscribe. The next crisis is already forming, and with it, the next Greenland is just over the horizon.